God made the world and everything in it. The Lord of heaven and earth made all nations and all peoples to inhabit the entire earth, and God allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live. And God placed within each human heart a strong desire to know their Creator, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for Him and find Him, though indeed God is not far from each of us. The human heart was created to desire the one who created it. Within each of us is this innate longing to seek after the one who is Lord of heaven and earth. And yet, each of us, at some points in our lives, confuse this desire for God with the desire for something else. And instead, we seek to sate our hunger with something else which is not God. As Paul walked through the city of Athens, he was deeply distressed to see that the city was full of idols, shrines made by human hands, created in the hopes that they might grant security and fulfill the people's basic needs and heartfelt desires. If Paul thought the city was full of idols then, I wonder what he would think if he would catch a glimpse of our world today. There are so many things created by human hands that seek to draw our desires and passions away from God. We are so easily led to believe that if we were able to achieve or obtain these things, then we would be truly satisfied. We cling to these idols, hoping that they will satisfy this longing within us. And though they may satisfy for a time, ultimately they leave us ravenous, longing for something else, yearning to fill the void that is welling up within us. And yet the desire remains. For each of us has this deep desire for God, to know God, though many of us are not able to recognize it for what it is. So many of us are searching for something, longing for something, though completely unsure of what it is that will ultimately satisfy this hunger within us. Ours, like the Greek culture that Paul found himself in while in Athens, is also, at least to a certain extent, a religious society, in the sense that many of us are longing to devote our hearts and our passions and our worship to something that is beyond ourselves. Many of us at least have the sense to recognize that our hearts are longing for something bigger, something beyond us, something more, though many of us don't quite recognize what or who we are truly longing for. While Paul was in Athens, he found this perfect example of this longing for something more. He came across an altar with the inscription, "To an unknown God." And Paul understood. He understood that the people in Athens recognized within themselves this longing for something more, though they were not able to completely understand who it was they were longing for. Paul knew firsthand the one who fills us, so that we want no more, the one who ultimately satisfies our hearts and our desires. And so Paul did what Paul does best. He proclaimed the one for whom their hearts were longing. He proclaimed Christ to them. Paul loved proclaiming Jesus because Paul loved Jesus. Because Paul himself was redeemed by Jesus in a burning light on a dusty road and a voice that struck him to the core. Above all, Paul understood that Jesus was of sole importance. We see this here as we read through the book of Acts. We see this as we read the letters that Paul wrote, still preserved in the New Testament. We see this in the words that Paul wrote to the Corinthian churches, the churches where he would journey soon after proclaiming Christ to the questing and curious Athenians. He wrote, "When I came to you, brothers and sisters, I did not come proclaiming the mystery of God to you in lofty words or wisdom, for I decided that I know nothing except Jesus Christ." Paul understood the heart's desire is Jesus, and therefore we who are witnesses need only proclaim Jesus to a world that so desperately needs him and longs for him. The Spirit of God was working in the hearts of the people there in Athens long before Paul showed up, and would continue working long after Paul left. In fact, as we saw as Kim finished the Bible passage this morning, that there were some curious for more, longing to know more, who joined their numbers and became believers. Paul merely came along and pointed out the true desires of their hearts. Paul proclaimed Jesus. We often fear that we aren't good enough to witness to the God whom we love. We fear that we ourselves aren't in the right place to be spreading the good news to others. Who are we to claim we have all of the right answers when we are questioning ourselves? Who are we to assume that we are worthy enough to speak on God's behalf? But the truth of the matter is we do not need to come with lofty words. We don't need to come with answers to all of the questions that some might have. And in fact, much more damage has been done when mission work assumes it is its job to convince everyone to think or believe or behave as the mission workers themselves. The world doesn't need more people spouting doctrines or eloquent speeches with the intent only to convince others of the rightness of their beliefs. The world doesn't need more people forcing others to behave in certain ways. There is too much of that already, and it's highly unlikely that any of these things will satisfy people's desire and need for God anyway. What the world needs, what all of us need, is Jesus. The world is full of people like you and me, people with full brains and empty hearts, people who are carrying our own burdens and pains, people who are broken and flawed, people who need a relationship, people who need to experience love, people in desperate need of Jesus. The Spirit has begun the hard work for us already. The Spirit is already at work in each person, reminding us of our deep desire for something beyond us and opening our hearts to receive Christ. The Spirit is at work within those of us who have already said yes to Jesus, transforming our hearts and our lives to look more like Him and how He lived in the world. Our job, our joy is simply to share Jesus with others, to tell the stories of Jesus, to testify to what Jesus is doing in our own lives and in the world, to embody His upside-down way in the world. And Jesus was one who was short on answers, but long on questions. He didn't often preach systematic theology, but he loved to tell stories, to proclaim God's good news. He was quick to criticize the establishment and the institutions of his day, but he often hung out with people that society had pushed to the margins. He was quick to extend grace and compassion, while also believing that people could live up to their full potential, believing they could live in a higher way, more in keeping with who God is. He would weep with those who had suffered terrible loss. He loved to break bread and eat with others. He would often spend time in prayerful solitude to strengthen and renew his calling. He sought out people, this group of friends, to surround him and join him in his mission. He saw people for who they were. People created in God's image. People burdened with their own pains and fears and flaws and brokenness. People longing to know the God who created and loved them. As Acts proclaims, we are witnesses. People called to proclaim Jesus to a world that so desperately needs him, a world full of people yearning for something beyond themselves, a world that is hungry and longing for Jesus. In his book, speaking of Jesus, Carl Medeiros tells the story about a time when he was asked to be on a panel with numerous religious leaders from around the city where he lived. The church that was hosting this panel for this community-wide discussion had invited religious leaders from around the community. They had invited the local Catholic bishop, the imams from local mosques and Islamic centers, and rabbis from synagogues. They had needed another Christian on their panel, however, and so they asked him. Well, Medeiros said he was quite hesitant to represent Christianity. He was much more drawn to focusing on Jesus and leaving the religious stuff to others. But the organizers of this event, who knew him and his passions, said that it was okay if he just talked about Jesus and didn't worry about explaining or defending the doctrines of Christianity. And so he finally agreed. Well, the evening of the dialogue began with respected leaders from the various religions sharing their thoughts on sin and salvation and other topics and questions that came up. Medeiros knew most of the other religious leaders on the panel, and indeed he was friends with some of them. He said that all of them did a fine job articulating various views and doctrines of their heartfelt beliefs. He said that they did a great job eloquently speaking on grace and the will of God and faithfulness and mercy and justice and who God is. And when it got to his turn, however, he simply talked about Jesus, sharing stories of Jesus, how he had come to know Jesus, and the tremendous love of Jesus. When the formal dialogue and discussion was over, there was a fellow Christian in the crowd who came up to him and said how frustrated they were that he hadn't shared about other doctrines or beliefs of Christianity. He had said nothing about the Trinity, nothing about atonement, and so on and so forth, feeling like he had missed the point of the evening. But while this Christian was talking to Medeiros, another man came up and said, "You know, if he had talked about theology or doctrine or even Christianity, I would not have been interested. I've heard all of that from my Christian friends. But he talked about Jesus in a way that I've never heard before and had never thought of, and I thought it was amazing." And another man who came up with tears in his eyes said that he had been wounded and hurt by Christianity, but he had always wanted and longed to believe that Jesus was, in fact, the Son of God. And so he asked if he could have further conversation to follow up in the days ahead. As Medeiros was about to leave, his friend, the local imam, came up and said, "Carl, you had an unfair advantage. While we were all busy defending our religions and our positions, you simply talked about Jesus. You cheated. And then he let out a huge laugh and slapped him on the back and said, "Good job." Medeiros reflected on this experience afterwards, saying, well, yes, we do have this unfair advantage. We know the Creator. We're friends with the Lord of heaven and earth. We know where the truth is found and its name. We know what brings life and what gives life and where eternal life resides. While others are explaining and defending various isms and ologies, we're simply pointing people to Jesus. Like Paul in Athens, sometimes all we need to do is point to Jesus, proclaiming that he is, in fact, the good news that all of us have been longing for. So proclaim Jesus. Give Jesus. Give Jesus to those who are far off and to those who are near. Give Jesus to those who have heard his stories all of their lives and to those who have never heard of him before. Give Jesus to those already within the church and those who are considered to be outside of God's grace. Give one another Jesus. Give Jesus wherever you go. Simply proclaim Jesus. You can have all this world, but give me Jesus. I invite you to turn in your your green Sing the Journey books to number 45. If you feel comfortable doing so, I invite you to stand and let us sing together, "In the morning when I rise, give me Jesus."